So this is my outdoor primary, a King Arms M4A1. This is the first of a few videos to go over the teardown, cleaning and general maintenance of this airsoft platform. Start by popping the lower receiver pin. For the King Arms M4A1, the pins are self-retaining, which is an added perk. Slide the upper receiver off the lower, minding the port cover, which may catch on the receiver pin. Also, as you slide, carefully pull back and gently pull up on the charging handle. Slide out the barrel, but be mindful not to lose the hop-up spring or the barrel centering ring. Your dust cover may pop off in this process, but just pull it out with its spring. For most sliding stocks, gently pry up on the sliding stock lever and slide the stock off towards the rear of the gun. This rear stock is the C.A.T.S. Enhanced Polymer stock. In the rear of my gun, I currently have a gate MRF MOSFET wired in the buffer tube. The buffer tube has also been ground and cut out via side slots for easier access to the MOSFET and wiring. Gently remove the MOSFET power and signal wire. You'll want a really long screwdriver, most likely a Phillips, to undo the buffer tube screw. Make sure not to lose either the large flat washer or the headed washer that comes with the buffer tube screw. For this gun in particular, I have a large, thick, flat cut washer that's used to anchor the buffer tube bolt. I've tried using other headed beveled washers from other buffer tubes, but they all resulted in the stock loosening over time. Really, this washer was the best one that worked for this gun. Next, remove the sling plate. Undo the two small screws on the rear of the grip, the motor plate base, to get access to the motor. Don't touch the center screws, that's for motor height adjustment. As I take screws or bolts off the gun, I like to try to keep the pieces together as much as possible to avoid losing or misplacing anything. If tech work is new to you, then I suggest using bins or another organizing system to avoid mixing up parts and to avoid losing things. Gently disconnect the motor connector wires from the motor tabs and slide the motor out. During this process, I'll also install a Gate Titan V2 rear-wired MOSFET. Check out that video separately if you haven't already. In this gun, I have the Tinley 35K long motor installed. Undo the two screws inside the grip, which attach the grip to the gearbox shell. In my case, I've used 3 screws to get a better alignment, which was achieved by confirming with a motor alignment tool. Pull the grip over the wires and set it aside. Be careful not to snag the wiring as you're pulling it apart. You may notice I have both my wires run on the same side of the grip. That was a preference at the time of installation, but more commonly you'll see them wired on both sides of the motor. Pop the retaining pin from the bolt catch and remove the bolt catch by unhooking it from the lower receiver. The King Arms bolt catch actually functions. The charging handle will actually keep the dust cover open until the bolt catch is pressed to allow for easier hop-up adjustment without having to hold the charging handle. Next, unscrew the mag catch. Some mag catches might look different, and the screw might actually be the entire mag catch itself. This mag catch has a small internally threaded screw to secure it, which I personally prefer. Just be careful not to strip the small screw. Pop the small lower gearbox trigger pin, located just above the trigger and near the selector switch. Pop the large receiver pin near the rear of the gearbox. The receiver pins are self-retaining on the King Arms M4A1. The next step is to remove the gearbox shell. Typically I find it a bit easier to remove if the selector is located halfway between semi and safe. In this gearbox, I've installed a special Modify Anti-Reversal latch that has an I-key head on the exposed end, which allows you to insert a flathead screwdriver and detension the gearbox prior to opening. Detensioning the spring will ensure there's no load on the gears as the spring is removed. Remove the 5 long screws and 4 short screws securing the gearbox shell halves together. I like to remove all but one screw near the rear until we're ready to remove the spring. This gearbox unfortunately doesn't have a quick change spring, so I can't remove the spring ahead of time. As you remove the last screw, just make sure you maintain a gentle downward pressure with your hands on the gearbox shell. As you get to the last screw removal, insert a small diameter screwdriver, but one that's long enough to extend into the gearbox, and hold the end of the spring and piston down. Keep pressure on the spring through the gearbox opening, and keep the screwdriver tilted on a downward angle, which helps keep the spring in place as you slowly lift the gearbox shell. As you lift the gearbox shell, the anti-reversal latch or trigger may also just pop off because they're spring loaded. As you lift the gearbox shell, do so slowly to ensure no shims are lost. Maintain downward pressure from the screwdriver during this whole process. Be sure to track all shims to avoid losing or misplacing any. I prefer to keep all my shims on the gears during this whole process so I know which gear and which face they came from. Lift up on the tappet plate spring to relieve the tension. Remove the tappet plate, spring, cylinder head with the nozzle all at once. Remove each gear, accounting for shims on both faces. I like to place my gears on separate locations on my work mat in case shims fall off, and then at least they won't mix gear to gear. Remove the anti-reversal latch. One underrated thing is shimming of your anti-reversal latch. You may not have shims on yours, but if you do, keep track of them and make sure they're all removed in the process. Remove the trigger and trigger spring. Remove the front trigger stop and spring mechanism by undoing the screw and pulling the two halves apart. Remove the screw for the cutoff lever. Just be mindful of the small spring joining the cutoff lever to the selector plate at the rear. Remove that small spring and the selector plate by sliding it forward. For normal maintenance, you may not need to remove your trigger switch assembly. However, I'm replacing this with a gate tighten MOSFET, which will replace the trigger switch assembly, trigger, and also the wiring. First, remove the spring on the trigger trolley. Undo the small screw securing the trigger plate down to the shell. Normally this would fully release your trigger and wiring entirely. However, you may have noticed that I have my wiring ran down the rear of the gearbox to the same side of the motor, and I also steel epoxy the trigger wire below the motor. The reason why I ran my wiring down the rear of the gearbox was to avoid having my primary wires for my motor running under the motor. This left just the trigger signal wire running under the motor to minimize the bulk and to minimize how many wires I have glued down. With the gearbox shell completely exposed and free now, you can start by cleaning and degreasing the entire shell. We will complete the cleaning and maintenance of the remaining gearbox components in the next video.